And a very warm welcome to the LBC 97.3 Book Club, which we hold every Monday evening here between 9 and 10 o'clock. Of course, last week you heard from Geoffrey Archer talking about his new book, And Thereby Hangs a Tale. Next week you're going to hear from two authors, Tim Worstall and Jessie Norman, about some slightly more intellectual subjects. And the week after that, it's Giles Brandreth who'll be here in the studio. But tonight we are joined by a trio of political stars. We're joined by Adam Boulton, the political editor of Sky News, who's co-written a book called Hung Together, the 2010 Election and the Coalition Government. He's written it jointly with Joey Jones, who we're just seeing on our TV screens is now in Dublin because he was supposed to be here tonight. But it's interesting that you're deputising for your deputy, Adam.
Yes, it's an honour.
It is an honour, isn't it? Yes.
It's an honour to be here, honour to deputise for Joey.
Well, we're delighted to have you here. We're also joined by David Laws. He's the Liberal Democrat MP for Yeovil, was all too briefly, I would say, Chief Secretary to the Treasury at the beginning of the coalition government. He's written a book called 22 Days in May. Now, that's all about how the coalition was formed and the first few weeks of the coalition. Welcome to the programme, David.
Thank you very much. Good to
and Rob Wilson, who's the Conservative MP for Reading East, I nearly said West. He's written a book called 5 Days to Power, which concentrates on those 5 days straight after the general election. Rob, welcome to the programme.
Thank you. And it also does have a bit of the preparation as well for all the parties.
Indeed. And I should declare an interest here because I actually published David and Rob's book, so let's just get that out of the way because Adam threatened to out me if I didn't.
Yeah, you didn't publish mine, which is why I'm the only one who got in advance.
Actually, that's not true.
Not quite true. You didn't pay advances.
No, just so shows how much you know.
I read on your blog you didn't pay advances.
Well, we try not to, where we can, but as all the publishers do now. Anyway, moving swiftly along, let's talk about the sort of first birth of the coalition, or not even pre-birth, because David Cameron and Nick Clegg did not know each other that well before the election, is my understanding. Adam, let's start with you. Can you just trace for us what your understanding of their own relationship is?
Well, I think the interesting thing about their relationship is David Cameron was definitely interested in getting to know Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg was not so interested in getting to know David Cameron. In fact, there were two kind of attempts for David Cameron to win Nick Clegg over. One was when he and Sam invited Nick and Miriam to come to dinner, and that invitation was turned down. And then secondly, there was actually an attempt to pursue common ground a bit more officially, and I'm sure David can tell us more about that Nick Clegg, on the advice of his party, actually again slapped the hand away, the hand of friendship away, and kept himself pure for when he had to do the real dealing after the election.
Well, I heard a story from Ed Vasey, who went on a trip to the Antarctic with Nick Clegg back when he was Shadow Home Secretary. He wasn't even leader then, and his mission then was to cosy up to Nick Clegg and get to know him and sort
in the tent,
make him feel the love. Either of you, David Laws, Rob Wilson, heard that one?
No, I haven't. I've heard they went on this trip together. I'm not quite sure whether the desired outcome was achieved.
I'll tell you what else they did while they were in that tent. It was just after we brought out a set of our top trumps, and they argued over who was the most fanciable.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's true.
That sounds quite possible.
Good high politics there. David, what's your take on the burgeoning relationship between Cameron and Clegg?
Yeah, I think it's right to say that they didn't know each other very well before the election, and also that Nick was pretty scrupulous in not wanting to engage really with either of the other two leaders. He wanted the party to be genuinely equidistant and not to be able to be branded as partisan in any particular way, not least because we had to fight both against the Conservatives in some parts of the country and Labour in other parts of the country. So yes, he was pretty determined not to be committed to either of the two of them. And actually during the negotiations, there was, I think, one particular meeting that the two of them had together. I can't remember whether it's on the Saturday now or the Sunday, where they spent a long period of time having shaken the media off in order to get to this meeting. And that was, I think, one of the first times that they really began to understand each other and build up some sort of trust, which has certainly blossomed in government.
Because Peter Mandelson is trying to spin a line that actually they were very close before the election. I mean, in this interview that I've just done with him, he was absolutely adamant that Clegg and Cameron were very close friends before. Rob Wilson, what do you think?
That's clearly not true. And Adam's right. They didn't know each other particularly well, but they did have this meeting about MPs' expenses with their chief whips, all three party leaders, and there was the most explosive row between the three of them, in particular between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg. And I think both David and Nick left that meeting feeling that they'd been thrown together, and that I think one of the whips there described Gordon Brown as an obnoxious bastard, if I can use that on air. And that is a direct quote.
I suppose as you're quoting it's after 9 o'clock.
I think there were a couple of meetings where all three leaders got around the table, and one of them, Clegg actually said to Brown, there's no point in going on with this meeting, we're not getting anywhere, and sort of he and Cameron sort of collected their books and stomped out, and Cameron was certainly impressed by the determination which Clegg displayed on that occasion.
Well, I think also that Nick Clegg described Gordon Brown to his face as barking mad during that meeting as well. So there was this quite aggressive exchange. The testosterone in the room must have been amazing. But that was one of the things that people refer to, and certainly David Cameron and Nick Clegg refer to, as something that sort of built a bond between them.
And doesn't this illustrate that a lot of things in politics are about personal relationships? And again, Peter Mandelson denies that the initial conversation between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg presumably it was on the Friday after the election. Nick Clegg, I think, David, in your book, you explain that it was basically a monologue from Gordon Brown, or more or less a monologue, and yet Mandelson is now trying to say, well, no, it's perfectly genial conversation.
Yeah, it was misrepresented, I think, at the time, as if it had been some huge row, and that's not actually accurate. But it was essentially a monologue by Gordon telling Nick Clegg what he should do, not taking the signs from Nick that Nick was very committed to talking first to the Conservatives, as he'd promised to do so during the election, because they were clearly the largest party. And I think even Mandelson, in his own memoirs, acknowledges that this wasn't a great example of bridge building by Gordon Brown, that he'd been talking at Nick for, frankly, twice as long as it had taken David Cameron to have the same sort of introductory conversation. And if Nick didn't know David Cameron and Gordon Brown particularly well before the election, which is certainly true, what is also true is that the contact that he'd had with Gordon Brown wasn't a very good signal for the future, that he'd always found him quite a difficult person to deal with.
Well, we're jumping ahead a bit now. I want to talk to Adam a bit about the election campaign, because a lot of your book, Adam, is about how the election campaign started, the debates and all the rest of it. And you played a pivotal role in this, in that if it hadn't been for Sky News, and I think you probably personally, there wouldn't have been any debates.
Well, I should hasten to add, I think the real prime mover was my boss, John Riley, who...
Take the credit.
Well, no. I'll just explain that John Riley, we had a discussion quite early on in 2009. We were worried that the public, seemed to be turning off elections, and we felt, in just straightforward civic level, that anything we could do to raise the interest would be very important. And John had various ideas, and one of them was to really push for debates. And we talked about it, and I said, well, actually we can, if you're prepared to, we'll play quite rough, because there had been changes in the Representation of the People's Act, which meant that we could stage a debate. And basically say to leaders, we're going to stage a debate, you be there or be square. Now, that's not something, frankly, that the BBC would have been prepared to do, or ITV, who simply wanted a big prime-time event. And that was the track we pursued. And I believe, we can argue about this, if you like, but I believe that really did concentrate minds and mean that very soon we really had private agreement from the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives that if it came to it, they would debate each other with an empty chair for...
would you actually have done that?
Yeah, we would have done that.
Because that's quite dangerous, isn't it, for
we felt it was sufficiently important. Television remains the instrument of mass communication to the public. We felt that...
And radio.
Yeah, and radio, and it was on the radio as well. And, and we felt that staging those debates as public events, which anyone could televise, was worth doing and was worth taking the risk. And actually, one of the key things that we needed was to get the, if not written in blood, the private understanding that Nick Clegg and David Cameron would have been prepared to debate each other and say, where's Gordon Brown? And we felt we had that, which was why in the September of 2009, we launched our debate campaign saying we were going to do this because we felt confident at the end something would be achieved. I might add, to Gordon Brown's credit, he never said never, unlike his predecessor, Tony Blair. And I feel, and I'd be interested in what the real politicians are going to say about this, I feel one of the kind of untold stories of this election was that, the non-conservative Labour vote, all my lifetime it's been growing. From a period in the 1950s, before I was born, where there were like 3 other MPs in the whole House of Commons. And in percentage terms as well, that's up to about a third. And I actually give credit to all 3 leaders, not just Cameron and Clegg, but to Brown as well, in recognising that a proper debate had to recognise that there was something beyond red and blue. And the obvious way of recognising that was to give equality to Nick Clegg. And actually one of the really surprising things about the debate negotiations, which I didn't handle, they were handled by more reliable executives, was that no one really wasted time in saying, why are we having a debate at 3?
And
they all accepted that.
And as I understand it, the Liberal Democrats were expecting to be told that they could only appear in 2 debates, but that never was raised by the Conservatives or the Labour Party. But we might come to that in a moment or two. Now, if you've got any questions for Adam Boulton, for David Laws, for Rob Wilson about their books, what they've been talking about, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. It's 9:15. It's the LBC Book Club, and we're joined tonight by Adam Boulton, who's written a book with Joey Jones called Hung Together, David Laws, 22 Days in May, and Rob Wilson, 5 Days to Power. They're all about the aftermath of the election, and in Adam and Joey's case, the election campaign itself. And just before we went to the travel, we were talking about the debates. And I wonder what LBC listeners think about whether those debates really worked. Did they change views? Because they absolutely dominated the election campaign. Do you remember the debates? Do you think they should be held again, but maybe in a slightly different format? 0845 6060 973. Text me on 84850 or email Iain, IAIN, at lbc.co.uk. David Laws, we were talking about the debates there. You were at a couple of them, I think.
Yeah, I was at the second and third, and I'd also played David Cameron in the practice.
It can now be revealed
beforehand. Typecast again, I'm afraid.
What is
so
it?
yeah, I was
Conservatives' favourite Liberal Democrat.
Something like that.
That's your title.
But we'd obviously have practice sessions, as all the party leaders had, for a couple of months beforehand. So I'd been involved in that, and I was at the second and third debates, not the first one that really set things running.
And how do you do that when you play another politician? Because I think Alastair Campbell played David Cameron in the Labour rehearsals. So you have something in common with Alastair Campbell now.
Yeah, I just read most of Cameron's...
Watch it, because Adam Boulton might jump over the table.
I just read most of David Cameron's recent speeches, and obviously those speeches, particularly party conference speeches, present precisely the core messages of a party leader, the phrases that they would wish to use. So I found it quite easy to do that, and was seeking to pin Nick back on a lot of the issues about potentially supporting Gordon Brown. And I think Nick did fabulously in the debates. If anything surprised me, it was in the first debate the rather uneasy, unsettled start that David Cameron had. I thought that he would be fantastic in all the debates. And whether he was just nervous because he had most to lose, I suppose, in the first debate, I don't know. But definitely he surprised me that it took him some time throughout the debates to get into his stride.
And Rob Wilson, that first debate appeared to be a political game changer. We had the advent of Cleggmania and some very unhappy people in the Conservative Party.
You cannot underestimate the dramatic impact that first debate, I think it was the ITN debate, sorry Adam, that had that massive impact. And Nick Clegg's sort of pitch as the sort of master of the new politics really did from that point on, changed the Conservative strategy in the general election, because it tore out in one go 20 to 25 seats that they thought that they were going to win from the Liberal Democrats. So at that point, George Osborne went to David Cameron and said, look, it's likely to be a hung parliament now. We have to think how we're going to prepare for this. We have to think about what are our red lines, what we're going to do.
So had they not done that before the election?
No. This was literally after that first debate. Osborne went round to Cameron's house. They were discussing other things, and then they moved on to this and what they should do next. And that's when Osborne said, look, I want to get a small team together. And he gathered William Hague, Edward Llewellyn, and I think the other one was
Cameron's Chief of Staff,
and Oliver Letwin. And Oliver started the process of looking at the Liberal Democrat manifesto in huge detail and all the preparation that was behind their manifesto, to see where the areas of overlap were, to see where there were things that we could agree about, and also to look at the things that we might disagree about as well, to see what could be done about those areas as well. So it completely changed the Conservative orientation. So those debates were absolutely crucial.
Yeah, they were, and, you know, I have to say, we saw them as of a piece, so whether it was, you know, we actually literally drew straws as to who went first, who went second, so, you know, the success of, you know, take credit for the success of all of them, even although it was nice that each channel could do them in their own style. But, I mean, Robbie's absolutely right that the Conservatives did change quite early on during the campaign and started preparing. Liberal Democrats, of course, had been preparing and gaming the options, I think, for about a year before. And the interesting thing was that both, by the time the moment came, both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats had an idea not just of the rough principles and where the other party was coming from, but they actually had their negotiating teams in place. Yeah. And I think with hindsight, one of the criticisms would be that Labour were just caught completely off guard and you know, from the Friday on, were sort of making it up as they went along without any real official negotiators.
Which they deny, to be fair to them. I mean, they keep saying, no, we were prepared.
No, that's not
it's
true.
just that we didn't appear prepared.
I mean, Ed Balls will tell you the story if you ask him, but he got the call about Saturday lunchtime because there was this secret meeting going on in the afternoon with the Liberal Democrats, and he was appointed at that point to the negotiating team. He bombed down the motorway, had a couple of conversations with Andrew Adonis and Peter Mandelson, got to Portcullis and the pre-brief was that as he bought a cup of tea and walked across from across the floor in Portcullis House, which is part of the parliamentary estate, up to the third floor, drinking a cup of tea. That was his entire preparation for the first session with the Liberal
And he didn't even want to be there, but he was all he did a deal with Gordon Brown, which was he would come down if Gordon Brown would leave Downing Street and go to Scotland, because Ed Balls thought it looked bad that Gordon Brown was there, and he said, OK, Gordon, well, if you all go up to Scotland for a
lot of his MPs were furious about going to Scotland, actually.
But Ed Balls wanted it. He said, I'll come down and take part in the negotiations. And even at that stage, unlike the sort of quite calm exterior of the two other parties, Labour were changing the negotiating team, didn't know who would be there. I mean, one of my favourite things is David Miliband contacts Gordon Brown on the Monday and says, I think it's time to talk to the Liberal Democrats, unaware that they've been talking for 2 days, including his brother, Ed, in the team.
Yeah, I think it was only really Andrew Adonis who, before the election, was seriously planning. I've no doubt it was in Brown's mind somewhat before the election. But I think one of the problems that the whole Labour side of this revealed is that actually it was all left far too late. I mean, Gordon Brown had a long period of time to anticipate that we'd be in a hung parliament where his only option would be to negotiate with the Lib Dems. And yet, really, there was nothing serious from them until 1 minute after midnight, when really the votes probably didn't stack up for a Lib Lab coalition anyway.
Well, we're going to go back a little bit now, because we've got a caller, Darren in South Kensington, if you'd like to put your headphones on, chaps, who would like to talk a little bit about the TV debates that we were just discussing. Darren, good evening.
Yeah, good evening there, gents. I just wanted to put the viewpoint that going forward, I don't think we should have any more TV debates, because they are flawed. They're totally undemocratic. They're only giving voices to three centre-ground parties, and they are totally ignoring giving a platform to parties like Green, UKIP, BNP, etc. And also, I'd like to see the funding capped as well, because that's undemocratic.
Adam Boulton.
Well, on the funding, the television companies actually did the parties a favour, in as much as it didn't cost them a thing to take part in the debates. And so that actually kept the spending down. On the representation of other parties, it's true that all networks tried to find ways to represent those parties that already had seats in the Houses of Parliament, in other debates we did in Scotland and Wales and elsewhere. But you do have to draw the line somewhere, and I would argue that the parties who did take part in the debates accounted for, 90% of the votes that were cast, just under 90%. There were other attempts to put the nationalists in, so I don't really think they were undemocratic. I think what they did was they took the real political issues to the vast majority of the public who wanted to watch, over 10 million. And I'd say one other thing. I don't know what your political standing is, but I would say that as a result of the debates, the key issue of immigration was aired in all three of those debates in a way that normally mainstream politicians in election time tend to avoid it. And so I think that's one of the public services which was done by the debates.
It is quite a difficult thing to decide who should take part, I guess, but surely one of the criteria has to be how many candidates a party is putting up. And UKIP, BNP and Greens, certainly the BNP and Greens did not put up candidates in the majority of seats, and UKIP, I'm not sure, stood in many seats in Scotland and Wales, but no doubt somebody will correct me on that. Just a final word on the debates, David and Rob. Do you think they're going to be a bit different next time? Because they may well, if there's a fixed-term parliament, they may well coincide with the Scottish and Welsh elections. I mean, all sorts of headaches for the broadcasters then.
There will be headaches, but I think having taken this huge step, we're not going to go backwards. I think there'll be massive pressure under all the party leaders to agree to this in the future, and I think that the public will expect it and benefited from it this time.
Rob,
I
quickly.
think it's a fair point about some of the effect and the impact it had on the minor parties, but in actual fact, it completely swamped the local campaigns of all candidates.
Yeah.
It completely overrode anything I did in my constituency, and we might as well have not had much of a local campaign because everybody was talking about what was going on the TV.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with Adam Boulton, David...
84850 Iain Dale.
Yes, it's Iain Dale here with you until 10 o'clock on London's Biggest Conversation. And at 10, it's Clive Bull who joins us in the studio now. Hi, Clive.
Yes, I'll be here at 10 after all the leaks and discussion. Major changes to the rules on council housing have been announced. We're going to have a look at what those rule changes are and whether the system does indeed need a bit of a shake-up. America is considering ending invasive airport security checks. And
I quite enjoy them.
Well, some of these scanners appear to be almost like completely naked pictures. The man in charge says that there is a trade-off between security and privacy. But should there really be? Or is one of them rather more important? And we're also going to ask, are we really a nation of moaners? A study suggests that it's not just a national stereotype. We really are a load of whingers in this country.
Oh, for goodness sake, Clive.
So you can moan about that or prove it wrong. Either way, at 10 o'clock.
We look forward to it. That's Clive Bull. He'll be with you from 10 until 1 a.m. But until 10, we're joined by the authors of 3 excellent books. Adam Boulton, who's written Hung Together. That's a book that he's co-written with Joey Jones, published by Simon & Schuster at $18.99 in hardback. David Laws has written 22 Days in May, published by paperback at $9.99. And Rob Wilson has written 5 Days to Power, publisher Biteback at $9.99, also in paperback. Now, they're all books about the general election and the aftermath, mainly in Rob's and David's case, the aftermath of coalition negotiations. And I want to ask you if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask them on what happened, what's the main points of their books, if you think I've forgotten to ask them anything. 0845 6060 973. You might want to ask Adam Boulton about a certain encounter he had with Alistair Campbell. I've just whispered that. 0845 6060 973. Now, let's talk about the immediate aftermath after the polls closed, because the exit poll, I remember I was sitting here in this studio doing LBC's election night coverage, and I very rashly said when I heard the exit poll that if the Liberal Democrats only got 59 seats, I would run down Whitehall naked. Well, luckily they got 57, so I didn't have to fulfil that particular promise.
Didn't Danny Alexander say he'd join you?
He did. He absolutely did. I interviewed him, and he promised to join me. But luckily, that's another get out for me.
That's what he said to me.
But that I didn't believe those exit polls. Did you, Adam, when you first saw them?
I have to say I was sceptical. I was partly sceptical because one of the people doing the exit poll had informed me the day before that he thought they had the totally wrong sample and that they couldn't rely on the exit poll being accurate at all. At which point I thought, oh dear, I've just persuaded Sky to spend 250,000 quid or whatever it is on doing this poll. That said, I have to take my hat off, as I do frequently, to our cephalogist, Professor Michael Thrasher of the University of Plymouth, because when I raised an eyebrow on air at this poll and said, well, I'm not sure if that's accurate, he shot straight back. It is absolutely accurate, and you'll know that in a few hours' time. And the professor was right.
He was right. David Laws, you must have been incredibly disappointed when you saw that exit poll. Were you at all surprised?
I was very surprised at the poll. I mean, that morning I had spoken to Danny Alexander, Nick Clegg's chief of staff, who told me that he thought we were going to have something like 85 seats. The difference between 85 and 57 is a big difference for the Liberal Democrats. So we were expecting a much better result. I thought that the opinion poll must be flawed. And all of our experiences in Somerset and in my own constituency appeared to indicate that in our area, the Clegg mania bounce was actually happening. I was seeing it in my seat. Our results throughout Somerset were going up. It's just that it only seemed to work in Somerset rather than the rest of the country. So it was a big disappointment when we discovered that it was confirmed. And, very, very difficult for Nick, who'd gone right into election night, really expecting a much better result. And when I saw him come back from his own count in Sheffield, there was no doubt that, for him it was a big disappointment.
He looked completely gutted, didn't he? I mean, I remember the pictures of him walking along the railway platform. He just looked as if he'd had the stuffing knocked out.
Yeah, I mean, he'd been riding on the crest of this wave ever since the first debate. The second and third debates were not regarded as having been won by us by the same margin. The third debate very close. But there was no doubt that the election seemed to have gone extremely well for us, and we were expecting to be at least 3 or 4 points higher in the polls and to gain a significant number of seats. So it was a big disappointment, and it's rare that you have that difference on election day itself between your expectations as a party and the outcome. Normally you see these movements, even if they occur late in the day.
Rob Wilson, take us through what was going on in the Conservative Party that night.
Well, there'd been a realism that had been brought about the day before when the inner team of Cameron had met at Steve Hilton's house, which is quite close to David Cameron's house in Witney, and they'd all met and they'd all talked about what was the likely result. And they all did a sweepstake, actually, and I think Cameron got about 308. And they all thought it was going to be between 305 and 310, and they decided, right, we're going to go for a minority government. That was what they wanted to do, and they were going to get Brown out of Downing Street as quickly as they possibly could. Now, of course, when they heard the actual result, things started to change, and although they still wanted to get Brown out of Downing Street as quickly as they possibly could, they realised that the civil service actually wasn't going to enable them to do that, because this publication of this document by the civil service through the Ministry of Justice Select Committee before the election actually gave Brown the political cover he needed to stay in Downing Street. So they started to formulate new plans, and by 10:15, when the exit poll was out, they changed their message. Theresa May was on television at 10 o'clock, giving the we're going for government, and then that was slowly changed. George Osborne was wheeled out to Macclesfield Leisure Centre very early in the night to change the message, much to his chagrin, because he actually would then spent the next 4 or 5 hours at Macclesfield Leisure Centre, not knowing what to do with himself, because he'd been wheeled out early to give his view, and he'd given it, and that was that. He had nothing else to do.
Adam, when do you think the first signs of a proper coalition were forming in David Cameron's mind?
Well, I take the view, if we go back to the debates, that one of the effects of the debates was it did result in David Cameron and Nick Clegg beginning to build up that sort of relationship, and Cameron was again quite impressed with Clegg. Now, if you talk to Cameron about this, as I know we all have, he comes out, Ken actually coined this word and says that, after he went to bed for about 2 hours on the Friday morning, realising that he wasn't going to get straight into Downing Street, that he wasn't going to have a majority, that he basically woke up 2 hours later. Samantha had gone home because she couldn't sleep, and at that point he describes it as a epiphanious moment.
We know what you mean.
Yeah, the word is actually epiphanic, but he describes it as epiphanious, and that he realised that he was going to go that way, and I think that was certainly the moment when the rest of the Tory High Command was squared, and they realised that was going to happen. And then, of course, the moment of the year, really, in British politics was that moment in the St Stephen's Club when he came out and said he wanted to make what they always call the big generous offer. In fact, the word generous was not used, probably wisely, I think.
Rob. I mean, there was some early morning tension and argument within CCHQ when they all sort of arrived back, having fought their election night and heard their results. They all arrived back, and there was a real ding-dong between particularly George Osborne and Steve Hilton about, what the strategy should be, what they should do next. And in the end, Cameron just called a halt to it and said, look, enough of this. I'm going to my hotel for a sleep. Come back at 10 o'clock and we'll talk again. And that's exactly what happened. Now, he says that's when he had his sleep and he had this sort of conversion and woke up. Actually, I think the seeds were sown much, much earlier than that. I can't prove this, but I think that Brian Boulton actually had a big hand in this. He came to a Conservative Party away day event back in...
We should explain, Brian Boulton was a Labour MP in the 1970s. He was then the presenter of ITV's Weekend World programme.
Right. And he came to present to this Conservative Party away day, and we talked about the prospect of a hung parliament, and his view was, in that scenario, what you should do is you should bring the Liberal Democrats into a coalition government, and what would happen is what had always happened with those sorts of arrangements throughout history. And I think that's where the seed came from.
I'm dying to know what that means.
I think you know
the meat in the sandwich gets squeezed.
I mean, what was interesting from our perspective is that we almost didn't listen to the big, bold announcement or whatever it was that David Cameron made, because we were of the view that he would make that announcement anyway if there was a hung parliament, whether he was serious or not, because we thought tactically it would make sense for him to reach out. If we then recoiled as Liberal Democrats and said, oh gosh, we can't afford our purity to be imposed upon in this way, then we would take the blame if there was no strong government, no majority in a second election. So we regarded it as very likely there would be that offer, but that tactically, it would be designed tactically rather than have a serious purpose. And I think what's interesting is that it then took us some time to recognise that this was probably his desired outcome rather than a tactical manoeuvre, although I still think that had we not at some stage brought the Labour Party into play, he probably would not have been willing to make the offer on an AV referendum, which really was the key to bringing the Lib Dems into coalition.
I can't remember in which book it was, but in one of your books, was it Andrew Stunnell said, my God, he really means this.
Yeah. So that was in my book, yes. I mean, he was very sceptical, Andrew, and I think, as David will confirm...
He was the Liberal Democrat chief whip at the time.
He what?
Wasn't he? Former chief whip.
The link to the grassroots.
Yeah. And he did a somersault. He completely changed his mind. He could see that Cameron was genuinely making this offer, and he welcomed it.
Andrew was always very sceptical, though, and actually almost the most consistent of all of us in saying, after the results came in, there is no way that we can prop up this Labour administration. They've lost their majority. It's not going to work. And Andrew, even though he would be regarded as the most left wing of the four of us in the Lib Dem negotiating team, comes from the local government base, and he's used to, in local government, Lib Dems dealing with both other parties throughout the country, so he doesn't come to it with some presumption that we can only deal with one of the two parties.
And I think there is, as Rob was saying, I think there is a sort of outside factor in all of this, which that a lot of work had been done by the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Gus O'Donnell, by the Institute for Government, which almost seemed to have been created for this purpose, to actually say, there's a possibility indeed a likelihood we might get a hung parliament. Let's just slow this down, not rush at it, not grab at it in the way that it had been done in the 1970s. And they had created these conditions so that, Gordon Brown could come out and say, right, the rules say that I stay Prime Minister until such time as there's a viable alternative. And that gave the 5 days to power, or those days in May, as in the titles of colleagues' two books. And that really was a change in British politics, that people could actually sit down, talk, work these things through. And I think that was a pretty deliberate attempt by the civil service to try to end sofa government and actually take back power into, doing it by the rule book to a certain extent.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club. It's 10:15.
Vast selection of programme podcasts. Go to lbc.co.uk/podcasts.
It's the LBC Book Club tonight with Adam Boulton from Sky News, political editor. He's written a book called Hung Together. David Laws, Liberal Democrat MP for Yeovil. He's written a book called 22 Days in May. And Rob Wilson, Conservative MP for Reading East, has written 5 Days to Power, all about the aftermath of the general election and the coalition negotiations. Let's draw the discussion to a close on the actual negotiations themselves, because they went on for these 4 days, which for those of us who seem to spend our entire 4 days on College Green giving the nation the benefit of our thoughts, well, it seemed like an eternity. But in practice, compared to European coalition negotiations, they were over in a flash, David Laws.
Yeah, they were. They went absolutely as well and as smoothly as they could possibly have gone. But if we had delayed much longer, then we would have got the media and the public getting quite impatient, I think, because the expectation is we form governments quite quickly in this country. But there's nothing inevitable about this being a smooth process. I'd been up in Scotland in 1999 when we had the first coalition after the first election for the Scottish Parliament. And goodness me, it was a nightmare trying to get an agreement between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, even though both parties knew that was the only possible outcome of the election. This, on a rating between 0 out of 10 and 10 out of 10 for smoothness and ease of process, was 10 out of 10, and goodness knows whether it will ever be repeated in that form in the future.
Was there ever a time, and you were on the Lib Dem negotiating team, was there ever really a time when you seriously looked at going in with Labour, or were you just going through the motions?
We did look at it seriously. I mean, in particular, before the meeting on the Monday where Gordon Brown...
Rob Wilson's smiling.
We did look at it seriously, and there were lots of people who wanted it looked at very seriously. But the problem all along, and I put it in my book, on the night of election... on election morning itself, in my phone call with Andrew Adonis, is that, frankly, the numbers never quite added up. I mean, it would have been a Lib-Lab coalition, which would then have required a side agreement with about 4 or 5 other tiny parties to get a majority. And frankly, it would never have worked. So we explored it, but ultimately, more than anything, the arithmetic meant that it wasn't a serious prospect.
Rob, there was a point in this period when the Conservatives thought, actually, this isn't going to work, is it?
There was, but can I just say on the time point that it worked out so well and it happened so quickly, because I think the Liberal Democrats did make up their mind very early in the process who ideally they would go into government with, and I think that was as early as the Friday night. They were thinking, right, we're going to talk to the Conservatives and we're going to try and do a deal with the Conservatives. Now that was subject to bringing their parliamentary party with them and subject to other things as well, but that was the target.
But I can say that is not actually true. And what made it easy for us, Rob, is that we had... It was the only way we were going to carry the whole party, but actually it's the way that it happened, is we eliminated each of the 4 options, either because they would have led to a second general election, or because there was no Labour majority, or because Labour didn't concede. And the Tory option was ultimately the only viable option that there was.
I can say this very quickly. There were 2 other factors. One was the Liberal Democrats actually needed that time to bring themselves round to leaping into bed with the Conservatives. Yep. I mean, they were that willing. But the second point, which I think, I go into in this, me and Joe go into this book, is that the extent to which the Labour Party collectively were never going to buy this deal. I mean, there were a lot of people in the Labour Party who just, from the Friday night or the Friday morning, were saying, with a result like this and figures like this, the dignified thing is to go into opposition and regroup.
Exactly. And a Labour deal was never going to fly.
When you were talking to Alistair Campbell about this, Adam, and I mean, you were essentially saying, look, why are you here as an unelected representative of this administration trying to spin us a line which clearly isn't true, and that confrontation became quite aggressive. I think you would agree.
Well, I mean, there is a big account of that in Hung Together. I mean, look, there were a whole load of things going on there. One was that we were all quite strung out, and losing my temper on air is not something that I'm particularly proud of. But the underlying thing was that from Gordon Brown will try to stay on as a caretaker, which was the kind of rules. Unelected people, Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson, Andrew Adonis, persuaded themselves that it actually meant almost that Gordon Brown had a God-given right to stay on indefinitely as Prime Minister. And I was trying to say to Alistair Campbell, look, the figures aren't there. You haven't consulted your own party. I know lots of people in your party who are speaking to me. I mean, at that stage, we'd had about 42,000 meetings of the Liberal Democrats. The Conservatives had been having daily meetings. At that stage, the Labour Party had not been called together. The Cabinet had not been called together. And I was simply saying, isn't this a bit of a hijack, particularly when the figures aren't there? I think, in terms of the substance of the argument, I had the better of it. But Alistair retaliated by making it personal, making, in my view, insinuations against me which weren't justified.
Have you spoken to him since?
Oh, yeah. We've known each other for best part of 30 years, and we've got lots of friends in common. I've seen him about 3 or 4 times since then.
Marvellous. We always like a happy ending, don't we? David, when was it clear to you? What was the moment when you thought, yep, this is going to happen?
Well, the moment when it was absolutely clear that the Conservative option was the only option was after we finished our meeting with Labour on the Monday evening. This great opportunity opened up for discussions with Labour. Apparently, David Cameron went home and told his wife he thought that he'd missed out on the opportunity to be Prime Minister. At exactly the same time, we were having this disastrous meeting with Labour where it was clear to us that the negotiating team was divided, where they weren't prepared to offer us anything serious on policy, where the numbers didn't add up, where the deliverability of the alternative vote, changing the electoral system wasn't there. By the end of that meeting, as far as all 4 of us were concerned, the Labour option was stone dead, and therefore there was only one single option left on the table, which was coalition with the Conservatives, and that's what we reported back to Nick.
And then, of course, the next day you were appointed to the Cabinet, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, your dream job.
Yes, the day after that, it was the Monday where we'd had that crucial first serious meeting with Labour, and then the Wednesday morning when I got the call to go along and see David Cameron for that job, which, as you kindly noted, was didn't last quite as long as
well.
It didn't.
It didn't. But you made such an impact in the short time that you were in it that there were so many people, I think, thought that you were absolutely made for that job, and then it all ended in the way that we know it ended. How much of you wants to go back? I mean, presumably if you were given the chance of a return to Cabinet, you would grab it.
I don't know. I mean, you're trying to very wisely pull me down this route of speculation.
I'm just asking you a question.
I don't think I want to go. I mean, of course it was extremely difficult, but, I'm carrying on my work as a local MP. I've got the opportunity to come onto this programme with you, which I wouldn't have had otherwise if I'd been in the Cabinet. And I'm lobbying seriously on the issues and the policies that I'm very passionate about, that were in the manifesto, that were in the coalition.
So we'll take that as a yes, then.
No, don't take it as anything.
And
a good attempt.
In sort of 30 seconds, how do you think the coalition's worked out so far? What has happened that maybe you hadn't expected?
I think it has worked much, much, much more smoothly than one could ever have imagined, bringing together the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, which, after all, were arch enemies, really, for the best part of 20 or 30 years, which had most of our members thinking that if there ever was a coalition, it would be between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Who would have thought not only that no MPs or peers would vote against this arrangement when it was voted upon, but also that the government would be working so closely together, and not just, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, but Steve Webb and Iain Duncan-Smith at the Department for Work and Pensions. You could hardly imagine people at further ends of the political spectrum in the House of Commons.
Rob Wilson, there are tensions, though. Let's not delude ourselves in the coalition. There are always going to be, particularly, I think, over the spending review and the level of cuts that are about to hit the nation.
I think those tensions are mainly on the backbenchers rather than the people that are actually serving in government, because what I find from the ministerial teams is they talk very highly of each other. They say things are working well, that think that the departments are very effective in what they're doing, and the government is being extremely radical as a government. I mean, I think this is the most radical government since Margaret Thatcher's second term, which...
Don't frighten my colleagues.
Well, I think it is, and I think for that reason, you know, the teams have gelled well together, they're working very effectively, and, you know, you talk to Liberal Democrat members of the Cabinet about David Cameron, and it's quite incredible the way they sing his praises. I found that one of the most disconcerting things about all the interviews I did for my book. They were absolutely amazed by the performance of David Cameron.
Adam, the Labour Party has quite a difficult task now because they've never had to cope with a coalition before. They've got a new leader, fairly inexperienced new leader, wasn't voted for by the MPs or party members. How do you think that Ed Miliband is going to approach opposing this government over the next 6 months?
I think he's done absolutely the right thing, which is to have a thorough policy review. He's got time on his hands, and I think, you know, there is an opportunity for Labour in as much as they have the opposition to themselves to a certain extent, and so they can develop in different directions. I mean, you know, it's been a bit of a slow start for Ed Miliband, but I think he's got a lot of time on his hands, because it seems to me that one of the things about this whole coalition government is that it ought to last for 5 years, not least because both parties, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, have got to prove it was worthwhile if they want the voters to renew their mandate. So I think it's going to be a really, really fascinating 5 years, but I don't expect an election before 2015. Famous last words.
David Laws, your party's stuffed, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, of course, there are big challenges being a coalition when you've got to deal with a deficit the size that we've got now. But we've also got Lib Dems in government, you know, up to Deputy Prime Minister level. And what are the problems that people have always described on the doorstep about the Lib Dems in the past? You lot never have power, you know, you can never take decisions. Now, that is definitely given the light. But as Adam said, we've got to prove over the course of a parliament that we can deal with these problems before going back and asking for a new mandate.
Well, thank you to all of you. That's the end of the LBC Book Club this week. Adam Boulton's book, Hung Together, is $18.99. David Laws, 22 Days in May, $9.99. And Rob Wilson, 5 Days to Power, $9.99. This is LBC.